Okay, we are in the book of Daniel, and we are going to be in chapter 9. We slowed our pace a little bit last week and just did the first part of chapter 9, the prayer of Daniel, which we'll review in just a second. And then we're going to finish up Daniel 9 tonight. I'm somewhat confident that we can at least do that, although it's fairly difficult material, as we'll see. But I'm a little bit optimistic that we could even finish with enough time to quickly cover chapter 10, which is the intro to the final section of the book, chapters 10, 11, and 12. So the rest of that we'll do over the course of the next few weeks, not having class on Thanksgiving, because we typically will do on Thanksgiving, but the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, we typically have a singing and prayer service with so many people gone that Wednesday. So, the book of Daniel, remember that one easy way, natural way to break up the book or to understand the book is that the first half is a bunch of stories, kids' stories that we use in Bible class a lot. And then the second half is confusing visions that Daniel sees that we don't really understand. But we have tried to, over the course of this class, and if you don't really get much out of the class, maybe you'll at least remember this, that there's probably a better way to understand the structure of the book or the main sections of the book, which has to do with the language that the book is actually written in. So Daniel is a very unique book in the Old Testament, in the Bible generally, that it's written in multiple languages. And so after a prologue written in Hebrew, the standard language of the Old Testament, remember that the next 6 chapters, chapters 2 to 7, are in Aramaic, and then the chapters after that, chapters 8 to 12, are again in Hebrew. And so we have tried to suggest from that it's at least possible, if not likely, that determines the theme, the message, or the scope, or the intended audience, perhaps even, of these sections of the book. So because Aramaic is a more universally understood language at the time, more of a regional language, then the content of those chapters would also bear out that the theme of that section is about God's rule in the kingdoms of man more broadly. And remember, there's the bookends of this section, chapter 2 and chapter 7, deal with dreams or visions that see the next 4 world empires, right? And then after that, the kingdom of God that fills the whole earth. And so this is a very universal section that talks about the world empires, world rulers, people like Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, so on, okay? But this last part of the book, the visions in chapters 8 to 12, narrow their focus back to the people of God, the Jews, the people of Judah, and their fate, really, in the coming centuries. And so the theme of this section has to do more so with them and God's special relationship with them and how He is looking out for them. And chapter 9 is an easy example of that. Chapter 9 takes place right at the turn of the empires during the exile for the Jews. So Babylon, who took them into exile, has fallen. Persia has taken over. And it's in that first year of Darius or Cyrus, assuming he's the same person in the book of Daniel, takes over, that Daniel prays this prayer. And these are the questions I asked you, so see if anybody wants to venture out and answer them here. Why is Daniel praying? What prompts him to pray the prayer in Daniel 9? Brian?
Well, Daniel by now is probably fairly aged. It appears to me that he has a sense of the time frame that they're going to be in captivity, but at any rate, he says the book specifically says that he consulted Jeremiah to determine that specifically the 7 years that they would be in captivity. And so he knew that they were about to come to the conclusion that which prompted this work.
Yes. Thank you, Brian. So Daniel can tell time, like the rest of us, and knows that God had said through Jeremiah that this would be 70 years of exile, and then the people could go home. And so 70 years are up. Daniel's been reading that in Jeremiah, and that prompts him to pray this prayer. Another thing kind of just coinciding with that, remember that part of the 70 years prophecy, I'll show you where that is in just a second, was about Babylon's downfall. So it wasn't only 70 years to be out of the land and then you'll get to come back. One of the places in Jeremiah actually said 70 years and the king of Babylon will be overthrown, right? Babylon itself will fall, right? Well, that's just happened. Like I said, we're right at that turning point. Babylon's down and Persia's up. And so that probably plays into that as well. What is the prayer of Daniel 9 all about? How would you summarize this prayer in a nutshell? Have mercy on us. Anybody any more succinct than that? More succinct than that, Brian? Have mercy on us?
That covers it. I compared it to Ezekiel with all of their sins. The difference being this is he's praying for half of himself, confessing the sins, asking for God's grace.
That's right. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Michael. It is a prayer of confession. And the prayer just goes back and forth. We won't rehash all of that tonight. Goes back and forth between praising God and declaring God's righteousness and holiness, right, for your name's sake, okay, and confessing the people's sin. We have at every turn been unfaithful to you, and so this is now a plea, not based, he says, on our own righteousness, but based on your character, God. Please hear us and deliver us from this, second slavery, so to speak, because he mentions the Exodus from Egypt and is praying for a similar sort of deliverance. Okay, that brings us then to the rest of chapter 9, but all this is tied together. So this was a slide we ended on, not quite looked the same, but these same verses were on a slide that we concluded with last week. The background passages for really understanding what's going on in Daniel chapter 9. One is this passage from the end of Leviticus, in which God is telling the people, here's what's going to happen over the course of your history. Okay, specifically, here's what's going to happen if you are unfaithful to me, unfaithful to this covenant. And after a whole bunch of terrible things are listed that God would do to his people to try to get their attention and punish them for their unfaithfulness, right at the very end, in Leviticus, God says that eventually, because you're so unfaithful to me, I'm going to remove you from the land, okay? And at that point, the land will finally be able to enjoy its Sabbath years. And in the history of Israel and Judah, in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, it mentions this very thing. It says that the people were taken off of the land, taken into exile, into Babylon, as we've been talking about. And at that point, the land could enjoy, God was doing this so that the land could enjoy its Sabbath years. Now, I'm thinking I may work this into a sermon because we've been talking about the Sabbaths and the yearly, festivals in the Law of Moses. So we may get to this in more detail. But maybe briefly tonight, do you remember about the Sabbath years? When were they and what were they? So the Jubilee is something different, but let's start with the standard Sabbath year. When were the Sabbath years? Yeah, Albert says every 7 years. Honestly, good job, Albert, but that's not a hard guess. Everything's 7, right? So 7 something. Every 7 years, Albert, what were they supposed to do? How was it a Sabbath year? Let the land rest. Don't plant, don't work, don't plow, don't reap, okay? And God was going to provide for them, similar to every weekly Sabbath, right? Remember in the wilderness, they wouldn't collect manna on Saturday, and they would just trust that what they collected on Friday was enough to carry them over, right, until Sunday, basically. Same thing with the Sabbath year, okay? Imagine in an agricultural society not working for a whole year, but trusting that what you would bring in the year before, God would provide what you need, and you would let the land rest that 7th year. Okay. Now, Brian mentioned Jubilee. Anybody remember when the Jubilee is? 50th. And why is it 50th? Yeah, 7 times 7 is 49, and then the next year would be the Jubilee year. And some people figured that as the first year of the next cycle, so it really was every 49 years. And so the Jubilee year would be year 50 and year 1, if that makes sense, starting the next cycle. Okay. And Jubilee was extra special. So same kind of thing. You let the land rest on the year of Jubilee, but other things happened. You remember what they were? Property restored back to its original owner, had been bought and sold, but whoever it was by birthright, it went back to them. What else? Release the slaves. What else? Debts forgiven. Okay, and those two things often went hand in hand. Debts forgiven, slaves released, land reverted back to its original owner. That was the year of Jubilee. That was the seventh year, okay, or the 50th year on the Israelite calendar. But let's stick with this for now. We'll bring back the Jubilee in just a second. But Leviticus and Chronicles says that the exile was going to let the land finally have all of its Sabbaths. Now, let's go back to what Jeremiah said. What did Jeremiah say how long the exile was going to be? 70 years, right? Let's do a little bit of math here, okay? And this, I think, is important for multiple reasons. One, because it helps us to understand 70 wasn't necessarily an arbitrary number, right? God had a reason behind a 70-year exile. Similar, I just thought it seemed like this is connects. It's just another example of the same sort of thing. Same thing with the wilderness wanderings. We all remember how long the wilderness wanderings were, right? How long was it? 40 years. You remember why? That wasn't just an arbitrary number. Why was it 40 years in the wilderness? No, but why 40 years? Why not 50 years? Why not 30 years? 40 is a nice round biblical number. But it was 40 years, the text tells us in Numbers, 1 year for every day the spies were in the land of Canaan, checking it out when they brought back the bad report. You see what I mean? Sometimes these numbers are just they're what they are. But oftentimes these numbers have a connection. So we're back to this here. Sorry if that confused us for a brief moment. Babylonian exile, it says, would be 70 years. Okay? The law and Chronicles told us that those 70 years were letting the land have its Sabbath. So here's what this means then. 70 years of exile means that each of those 70 years was one Sabbath year that the land didn't get in their history, right? So 7 and originally, first you had the period of the judges in which there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of chaos, right? Not a lot of leadership and organization. Okay, but once there was a king, and if you remember all the way back to Deuteronomy, the king's job was to enforce the law, right? Make sure the law was upheld in the land. Well, from that point on, there's accountability because the kings were supposed to uphold the law in the land. But from that point on, they had roughly 490 years of not keeping the law, not keeping the Sabbath years. And so by the time you get to the days of Daniel, God says, I'm going to give my land its Sabbaths. And it's been 70 Sabbath cycles that you've missed, and so it's going to be 70 years of exile for the land to finally have its rest. Okay, questions. I'm happy happy to take any questions you have tonight. Can't always guarantee answers, but any questions on this here? Okay, now just for fun, how many Jubilees is that? It is. It's 10 Jubilees. Okay, so 70 Sabbath years, 10 Jubilees, another nice round number. 10 Jubilees that they missed, 70 Sabbath years that they missed, and so the land is finally going to have its rest. Okay, let's plunge ahead then, and you'll see why this matters a little bit more as we go through the rest of Daniel chapter 9. So Daniel has prayed his prayer. You see that conclude in verse 19 when he says, O Lord, hear, O Lord, forgive, O Lord, pay attention and act, delay not for your own sake, O God, because your city and your people are called by your name. Notice that his prayer is about your city and your people. Keep that in mind. So, we continue in Daniel chapter 9. In verse 20, Daniel gets a response. While I was speaking and praying, he says, Daniel 9:20, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God. While I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in a vision at first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. So he'll go on to explain some things, but just stop right here. I mean, there's some pretty cool stuff, even in this initial response that Daniel gets from Gabriel. Okay? It is immediate. In fact, notice in verse 23 it says, at the beginning of your pleas, and this is amazing. He says a word went out. So here's an angel, here's Gabriel talking about the response, the heavenly response to Daniel's prayer. And he says, as soon as you started praying, the word was sent in the heavenly places, and the response was begun. Okay, an immediate response to Daniel's prayer. Gabriel figures somewhat prominently in the book of Daniel. He's one of just two named heavenly beings in the Bible, him and Michael, the archangel. And it could be that Gabriel, especially his New Testament kind of a role of bringing the good news to Zacharias and to Mary, right, that he is a bringer of good news, which may factor into the message that he has for Daniel here in Daniel 9 and signify that this is ultimately a message of good news that Daniel is getting here in Daniel chapter 9, but happy to be wrong on that. What he tells Daniel is that he's going to give him insight and understanding, and he says that Daniel is receiving this because he is greatly loved. And to me, this fits. You read the prayer of Daniel 9 and you see someone whose heart, all the stuff we talked about last week, whose heart is sincere to the Lord, who is humble before God, recognizing his sin along with his people, and desperately desiring God's glory and God's will to be done. And so it makes sense that he is called a man greatly loved, and that he is responded to by God in this way. Okay? Well, let's see what the response is. Let's read the rest of Daniel chapter 9. In fact, does anybody have a New American Standard I can steal? Thank you, Brian. I'll trade you if you really want, although the writing's a little small. I'll get you back in just a second. All right. Daniel 9, 24 to 27. 70 weeks, Daniel is told. Here's his answer. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay, thank you, Brian. Okay, this is what Daniel is told. 70 weeks. That is some period of time that we'll discuss in just a second. But we're told, or Daniel's told, that this is about, again, the same thing Daniel had prayed about. People and the city. This is about your people and your holy city. Verse 24. And then in the next verse or so, this is what Daniel is told is going to happen by the end of this time period. So here's kind of the definite objectives, we might say, for this time period that is being prophesied. First is to finish transgression, verse 24. Maybe yours says to put an end to transgression. That could be interpreted multiple ways. I'm going to interpret it this way. You remember when Abraham was told that his people, his descendants would go and be slaves in a foreign land and for hundreds of years, and then they would come to the promised land? And God said the reason he was waiting was because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet complete. Now, I don't know how God was measuring that, but in God's mind, the iniquity of the Amorites hadn't filled up, okay? Hadn't gotten to the point where God was ready to bring judgment on them and send his people into the land. There's a similar phrasing like that in chapter 8, talking about the transgression of God's people, which will bring upon themselves the persecution of the king of Greece. Okay, I'm going to take this phrase that same way, that transgression has to be filled up. It has to be completed, right? And then a similar phrase next, maybe meaning the same thing. This is to put an end, or the literal term is to seal up sin, okay? For sin to be completed. Now, both of these phrases here, especially if your translation is a little bit different, you may be interpreting as like doing away with sin, like conquering it, dealing with it, something like that. I'm not opposed to that, okay? That may be how these are supposed to be interpreted. But sin has to be wrapped up or finished up or maybe dealt with, okay? Similar to that, and I think this is what this phrase means, iniquity has to be atoned for, or reconciliation has to be made, okay, by the end of these 70 weeks. Everlasting righteousness has to be brought in. Isaiah 53 verse 11 says that the suffering servant, the one who was wounded for our transgressions, would make many righteous through his suffering. 70 weeks here, by the end, everlasting righteousness has to be brought in. Vision and prophecy must be sealed up. Again, seal could mean a couple of different things. It could mean, again, to finish or to wrap up. It could mean to authenticate something. Think about putting your seal, your stamp of approval on it. To say vision and prophecy, validated, vindicated, or maybe both, and finished up and wrapped up. Okay? And then finally, that there will be the anointing of a most holy. That's all it says. It says to anoint a most holy. Brian's New American Standard had most holy place, but place is in italics, which means that the translators supplied that. They put that in because there's not a word there. Maybe it's anoint a most holy person. Maybe it's anoint a most holy place. But a most holy something. Okay. Now, we've kind of given away some of this already with the references I've made. But all of this, if you had to guess where all of this is going to be fulfilled, okay, just what would you start with? To say, well, it's at least what? Well, I don't know if I'm asking my question very well, okay? Among other things that this prophecy could be pointing to, it's probably at least pointing to, Jesus, right? That's the answer in every Bible class, right? Okay. We're talking about, dealing with sin and bringing in everlasting righteousness, okay? Again, among other things, we are dealing with a messianic prophecy here. And if that was kind of your gut as you were reading this, sounds like this is a lot of messianic stuff, trust your gut, okay? I think that's, again, at least one big part of it, probably the central part of it, okay? And so this is what I would say. Again, don't disconnect this from Daniel's prayer. Daniel's prayer was, we're a sinful people, and we've got ourselves in this big mess. God, help us, okay? Deliver us. And so God's response is that he is going to do something. God is going to act. But what's the source of all the problems for God's people? What's the reason that God's people always keep finding themselves in these horrible predicaments? Sin. It's sin. Sin is the problem, right? And so, there's a lot of other things in Daniel about what's going to happen to God's people in the days of the kings of Greece and all that, the kings of the north, the kings of the south, kind of giving them a heads up about the coming centuries. But I think right here is the central vision, the central answer for Daniel. Because really, all the other stuff means not much if God never finally deals with the sin problem, okay, once and for all. And so I think the 70 weeks prophecy ultimately does exactly that. It talks about how God's going to deal with the problem of sin and do so through his anointed one, your translation may say. That is the Hebrew word Messiah. It doesn't have to always mean Jesus. Sometimes that word is used of other people. But I think in this instance, the anointed one, the Messiah, is Jesus. How God is going to deal with sin once and for all. Okay? So that's at least something simple we could hold on to and take from this if nothing else makes sense. Okay, has anybody put it together yet? 70 weeks, right? 70 weeks is what? Very literally, a week is 7 days. And so 70 weeks would be 490 days. Okay. But what I think this is that each week is a week of years. I think we're supposed to be thinking just like we were a minute ago, with all the Sabbath years that the people missed and the land was finally given. Now there's going to be another set of 490 years going forward, right? So we're kind of like right here at the middle of the history, okay? This crucial moment where God's people are in exile. They had 490 years to really mess it up, okay? And to have total unfaithfulness to God, 10 Jubilee cycles of neglecting God's command, and so finally God sent them into exile for 70 years. Daniel is saying, God, what are you going to do about this? And he says, okay, I have a plan. Give it 490 more years, and I'm going to set it all right. And I'm going to deal with sin and bring in righteousness and deal with the holy city and the holy people once and for all. Okay, so that's what we would say. Again, 490, as we'll see, is not literal. It's kind of close in some ways, but it's more about thinking in terms of the 70 Sabbath year cycles and the 10 Jubilee cycles. 70 weeks, 70 times 7 is 490. And in 24, it's 70 weeks. Right?
Oh, 70 weeks.
Yeah. And then that, as we'll see, that 70 weeks is broken up into sub-segments. Okay. So let's go through this. The best way I knew how to drew it up, I'm sure there are better ways. Don't Google, you can Google this. There's so much nonsense about this out there. Googling this will only make you more confused. And there's a lot of really, just wild falsehoods out there about 70 weeks. Okay, I'm not saying I have it all right, but a lot of people out there have a lot wrong. So there's that. Okay? So the text says that in verse 25 that the starting point of this time period is when the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Does anybody remember? John has done a good job of setting the stage on this. Who gives the word for the people to go back and build Jerusalem? Cyrus, okay? And that's where we are, okay? Again, we're assuming Darius and Cyrus and Daniel are the same person, okay? And so this is like right now, or maybe the next year, 538 BC. From that point, the text says, God tells Daniel, 70 weeks. We're going to take that as roughly a cycle of 490 years until all this stuff happens. And again, we've said generally that this is messianic in its fulfillment, okay? But notice that in verse 25 and in 26, continuing, there is a breakdown of this 70-week time period. First, it says there's going to be 7 weeks, okay, the first segment here. And during that time, it says that I think that's Jerusalem, okay, because he just said that from the word, when the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So first, it shall be built again with squares and moats, but in a troubled time. So I think the first 7 weeks here, the roughly 49 years. By the way, this is like the first full Jubilee cycle, right? Is when the people are coming back. Think about the days of Zerubbabel and Jeshua building the temple, the days of Ezra restoring the practice of the law, and Nehemiah rebuilding the walls. This is this first segment of God's plan, the restoring and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. This is like a jubilee, isn't it? Everyone gets to go back to the land. It's like they're released from captivity. They're going back to the land that's rightfully theirs, okay? They're out of exile, right? Their debt's been paid off over the course of 70 years. This is jubilee for the people. They're back in the land, rebuilding and restoring. Okay? But then there's a period of 62 weeks that is glossed over, right? Not a whole lot is said about it. But it seems to be referred to here as a time of distress or a time of trouble at the end of verse 25. But you notice in verse 26, this is kind of just like after the 62 weeks. Right? And more of this time period is said. This is going to be, I think, the time in what we call in between the Testaments. So after the figures of the end of the Old Testament, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, after them, okay, there's this intertestamental period, And we actually do have quite a bit of detail in the prophecies in the book of Daniel in chapter 8 and chapter 11 and 12. But this is the time period that makes up the bulk of the time between the exile and when the Messiah comes, right? So we got 7 weeks of restoration. We have 62 weeks of great distress that we described in more detail in chapter 11. How many weeks is that? Almost there, okay? We're one short. By the way, this is not proportional, these boxes here, right? So I hope you weren't taking it that way. But there is this final week, okay? This final week. And what's said about it, starting in verse 26, is that in this final week, the Messiah will be cut off, says, or the anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. The city, the temple, the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed, the text says. It's unclear who he is. He will make a firm covenant with many, it says. It says that halfway through the week, who's he? But he will put a stop to sacrifice and offerings. In verse 27, you see that? Covenant for 1 week, but halfway through that week, he puts an end to sacrifice and offering. There is this desolation that comes on the wings of abominations at the end of verse 27. And then finally, that one who made desolate is destroyed himself. Destruction is decreed upon him as well. Okay? So, generally speaking, I think that this final week refers again to the coming of the Messiah and a lot of the events that revolve around the coming of Jesus in the first century, particularly again as it pertains to Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Okay, so you could think of things like Jesus being crucified. I think that's a pretty safe interpretation of the Messiah or the Anointed One will be cut off and have nothing. Okay, so that's there, right? These details that are given here about the destruction of the temple or the sanctuary and the city, okay, even though about the wings of abomination that come to make desolate, I think this should be interpreted as the aftermath, right, of Jesus' crucifixion, is that a few decades later, the Romans come in and destroy the city of Jerusalem. Jesus himself warned about that and even seems to connect the destruction of Jerusalem to the rebellion of the Jews in killing him, the Messiah. And that this was kind of their the punishment coming upon them because of their rejection of the Messiah. Depending on who the covenant or who's making the covenant in Daniel 9:27, this could be that the Messiah himself is making a covenant or confirming a covenant with his people, right? So the people of the Messiah are bound to him in this covenant. We call that the new covenant. The stopping of sacrifice could refer to religious persecution by the Romans. It could also refer to the fact that in the new covenant, the sacrifices and offerings are done away with, right? Through Jesus' work, the book of Hebrews says, there's no need for sacrifices and offerings at the temple, right? So you could take that a couple of different ways. Again, destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus uses the same language about the abomination of desolation in his prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if that's true, then the very end of this may very well be that Rome gets its comeuppance. Okay? But I think, again, people interpret this different ways, but I think that the end of this final week here of the 70 weeks is messianic, and it's the work of Jesus. It's the aftermath having to do with the city of Jerusalem and the Jewish people and what happens to them. But if you notice, it's a little bit hard to tell what happens at the very end, right? Because it says that there's going to be this covenant for a week. But then halfway through the week, right, all this stuff will happen. But then it never finishes. So what about the last half of the week? What about the last three? We got all the way through the 70 weeks. What about the last 3.5 days? And I think, I heard this suggested recently, and I like this, that it's left open because I don't know if we're supposed to see the 70 weeks as ending hard and fast in 70 AD or in the first century, but instead that we should see the last week of the 70 weeks prophecy as an ongoing time period that we're a part of even still, that even stretches on into eternity. Okay, and so there's a few phrases I've put up here. Okay, oftentimes in the Old Testament, you hear these phrases like the last days, and that refers to the days of the Messiah, which includes when Jesus comes, but also includes now. Right, we're still living in these last days. The last days is not like the final few years before something called the rapture or the end of the world or something. The last days is just the days of the Messiah after he comes and onward into eternity. Okay, and could be that that's what this is referring to. Okay, but think about what we've said about Sabbath, years, and Jubilee. If you're doing the math on the 70 weeks, and if it's 70 weeks of years, this final week is the last of the Sabbath years. Okay, it's also the 10th Jubilee. Okay, and so I think we're supposed to see this final portion of history as God lays it out, this final week as the final Sabbath year, the ultimate Jubilee. Okay, in fact, when Jesus comes on the scene in Luke chapter 4, he reads a passage from the book of Isaiah, chapter 61, where he refers to Isaiah, the prophet refers to the coming of the Messiah and the year of the Lord's favor. And almost everybody agrees that the year of the Lord's favor is the Jubilee. And Jesus says, this passage is talking about me, and this is what I came to do. Right? Jesus says he came to inaugurate the great ultimate Jubilee. Release from debts, release from slavery, being in the place where God has promised for his people, finally and forever. Okay, and we've talked about some of this as it pertains to the Sabbath in our lessons. Remember that Jesus came similarly. He came to bring rest. He came to bring the ultimate Sabbath. The Hebrew writer says there is still now a Sabbath rest available for the people of God. It's in Jesus. In Jesus we have this perfect rest because we've been delivered from our slavery. Okay, so I think the sense of Daniel chapter 9 is that God was working all this out to deal with sin, to deal with his people, to deal with the city of Jerusalem, but ultimately to bring in the final Sabbath, the ultimate Jubilee, the ultimate rest, freedom, deliverance, celebration for his people. All that comes through Jesus, and we're still living in it. And glory to God, we'll be living in it forever. Okay, as this continues into eternity, right? Okay, any questions? Like I said, can't guarantee answers. Any questions? Happy to take them here. Yeah, Steve. Yeah, I think, Steve asked about the 6 things. That was back on, I can go back all the way through this here. These 6 things right here, under 70 weeks, not this first one, but these 6 things here. The question is, however this plays out, these 6 things have to come to pass within the time period that is being told. So, and I would say that you could see if this is all fulfilled in Jesus, not only at his coming, crucifixion, resurrection, but even now into eternity. I would say all these things have been brought to be, right? That's one of the reasons why I think, say, to finish transgression and to put an end to sin is perhaps more about letting it come to its fruition before God acts, right? So if you imagine, again, in the days of the patriarchs and Moses, God is allowing the iniquity of the Amorites to fill up, and then he sends his people in to conquer them. You could think about the coming of Jesus in the same way. God is allowing sin and transgression to continue until he sends Jesus to deal with it, right? And he is the one who atones for iniquity. He is the one who ushers in everlasting righteousness. In Jesus, all vision and prophecy is fulfilled. Okay, that doesn't mean that there's nothing in Scripture that we're still waiting on, right? But it's all in Christ, right? It all points to Him. It's all fulfilled in Him, and He is anointed as the most holy one. Perhaps in Jesus, right? He is the new temple, so He is anointed as the new most holy place, and we are His temple. Okay, all that. But I think these 6 things do become kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? The markers to say these 6 things gotta be fulfilled, and I think they all point to Jesus pretty well. Again, there's questions about them, but they all point to Jesus and are fulfilled in Him. Does that answer your question, Steve? Honestly, I don't understand very much of it at all. So that's probably, that's going to be a area of weakness for me to try to understand premillennialism and the different variations of it and how it would, come to bear in a passage like this. So I'm trying to figure out what I think it does say, and then maybe down the road I'll get to try to figure out what it doesn't mean, But let me just end with this. So here's all this stuff is up here. Quickly, Brian.
I had another question.
Yeah.
Verse 26, we talk about the people, the city of the sanctuary. Is that a reference?
Yes, in my interpretation, the people of the prince that come to destroy are the Roman armies, right? That's the current ruler at the time, the Roman Caesar. His people come to destroy the sanctuary in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Okay, so I was going to ask you, tell me what we learned from all this. I'll just offer a few things as we close tonight, then we'll jump into chapter 10 next week. Part of, you read this and you're like, I don't get it, right? And Daniel doesn't really get it. You keep reading, you realize a lot of it, you're going to understand, Daniel, and at the end he's like, I have no idea. It's a reminder that God's plan is beyond what we understand. So not only in this moment, God's saying, hey, Daniel, I got it all figured out. Don't worry, okay? I trust you, God. But even still today, we read it revealed to us. A lot of this has already happened, and we don't understand it because God's plan is beyond what we really can understand. But basic points here, what we can take from it. Again, the plan is to deal with sin. God's plan in the end was to deal with sin once and for all, and that's been done. In Jesus, God has dealt with sin, and He has ushered in what we refer to tonight as the eternal Sabbath, as the ultimate jubilee, freedom from the slavery of sin, and full redemption. And that's a cause to celebrate and to anticipate the consummation of all this when Jesus returns. Okay, that's it. We'll get to chapter 10 on next week, and then move from there into chapters 11 and 12. Feel free to ask me any more questions you have afterward as well. Happy to discuss it.